Welcome everybody to the inaugural event in our new Secretary Speaker series. The reason that I wanted to launch a series like this is to make sure that our employees across the U.S. Department of Transportation are exposed to some of the most interesting and important ideas and people who are shaping conversations that touch our work. Sometimes the conversations will be very easily and obviously connected to the things that you do day to day, but this is not just going to be about transportation policy. I'm seeking to invite people that I think you'll be interested to hear from and benefit in hearing from in ways that'll really challenge us to think about the bigger picture that informs our work as part of the administration and as a Department of Transportation. And I can't think of a better speaker to begin this series with than Isabel Wilkerson. She is an extraordinary thinker, researcher, writer, journalist. As a matter of fact, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and an author who has written two highly acclaimed books about race in America, most recently Caste: The Origins of Our Discontents and The Warmth of Other Suns. She describes herself as a child of the Great Migration and is one of the country's experts on exactly what the Great Migration involved, which is something I'm looking forward to discussing here. This conversation, I think, will create a chance for us to discuss how issues of equity that are at the heart, not just of our policy vision, but our values as an administration and department, might be at stake in some of the work that we do that isn't always described as being connected to those questions. So that's why I'm really excited for this conversation. Ms. Wilkerson, thank you so much for agreeing to spend some time with us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. What an honor to be the inaugural participant. Thank you so much.
So before we jump into substance, and there's a lot of it for us to talk through, I wanted to ask a bit about process. I'm relatively new in the job that I'm doing, and all of us have found that our work processes have been changed profoundly over the course of the last year and a half. And so whenever I'm speaking to somebody who's delivered major pieces of work, but frankly, especially writers, I'm always very curious about process. I read somewhere that you spent something like 15 years just doing the research that led to one of the two books that I mentioned on the Great Migration. And so I'm just curious how you approach the process of your craft as a writer, especially since you've also been an academic and a journalist sometimes at the same time, and whether you've learned anything about the way you work through all the changes that we've all been living through in this last year and a half.
Well, again, thank you so much for reading and for engaging with this topic and with this work. You know, I approach things with an eye toward looking at from the ground up. I really believe that the answers are often with the people. You know, the answers are with people who have managed to survive in often forbidding and hostile situations. There's so much to be learned from everyday people. And so when I set out to work on The Warmth of the Suns to tell the story, 6 million people who fled the Jim Crow South and spread themselves all over the rest of the country, a phenomenon that had not been written from the perspective of the people who lived it. So I spent a couple of years actually just in some ways auditioning people for the role of being in the be a protagonist in the book. In other words, going to the people, going to the source of the phenomenon, to the people themselves, listening and hearing, sitting at their knee, being tutored by people who were the survivors of the phenomenon that I was writing about, doing a lot more listening than telling. I did not know fully where the story was going to lead me. They were going to lead me to the story. So my process is really from the ground up. It is not top down, it's listening. And then from that perspective, then figuring out what is the message, what is the mission, what is the underlying goal of the work itself. And they're the ones that ultimately are telling me what that story ultimately will be. When it comes to the actual writing, I view this as narrative nonfiction, and I think it's a genre that people, once they get into it, they really turn out to really love it, because it's something that allows us to engage with history, engage with facts, engage with verifiable research, but told in such a way that it flows in such a way that it pulls the reader in, because it's often focusing in on protagonists to tell that story. And so the work that I do requires that I, in some ways, kind of build a quilt. I'm creating a quilt. I have these pieces, these fragments and fabric that then come together somehow to create what I believe actually can be a work of art. I think that nonfiction can be a work of art. I think that projects such as this, if they reach the larger audience, can have great impact in the world. And I'm so grateful to you for being one of the people who recognize that.
Well, it really is incredibly impactful. And some of what you're saying about process, I think resonates with some of what we try to do as a department, this big agency whose decisions affect people in very intimate and direct ways, like how they get around their community or how they get around the country. And so we don't get to interview everybody who's impacted by a decision that's made here. But I love this idea of kind of auditioning people, some of whom are long past, and you're just going through documentary evidence and trying to understand their experiences. And I think we can learn something from that in our sometimes very formal ways of trying to understand what people are going through, like the comment periods that go into our rulemakings, but also just more generally as an approach. So turning to something that you mentioned that's very much a transportation themed set of questions, the Great Migration. This is where millions of Black Americans left the Jim Crow South for other parts of the country, and it really shaped the last century. I think even the word migration, relates to patterns of bird flight, right, which seem just so easy and natural, and I think. Also, when you talk about historical migration, it sounds so big that it feels like it just happened as this kind of general movement, this flow. But of course, it's made up of very specific, often very grueling journeys made by very specific people in their millions, whose stories you uncovered. And there's no separating this from the kinds of experiences that Black Americans faced in transit, on the rails, on roads in this country. And so I would love to hear some of the examples that struck you most, that really illustrated what was at stake and what it was like to go through American roads and rails, and the way people were treated differently along the way, and how that might shape the way that Black Americans and other minoritized groups perceive their travel and transportation experiences even now in 2021.
That's such an incredible question and point that you raise. And I could go on forever talking about this because that is so central. You realize how without the railroads and without the interstates, the migration might not have happened in the way that it did. It would not have been possible. In fact, the roots of the migration were set on the basis of the railroad lines, so that to this day, you can in some ways trace the history of the migration by going to by talking to people in the cities, the destination cities of the Great Migration, wherever they might be in the North or the West, whether Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Los Angeles, Seattle. And if you talk to people who are descendants of those who were part of the Great Migration, you will be able to find a direct link to the originating state that their families had been from. That's how beautifully predictable migration, wherever it may appear, in human history. Often there's a beautifully predictable set of coordinates that people will follow when they are attempting to migrate, whatever the migration stream might be. And so there are these direct links, and they track with the railroad lines, so that there was a migration stream up the East Coast. There was a line there, the Silver Comet. There are these legendary railroads that were the essentially the ways of escape. The escape routes were set by the railroad lines themselves. And then, of course, the interstates made it possible for people to drive to escape that way. And we know, so much has become more part of our mainstream understanding of our history, the idea of the Green Book, which was necessary to guide people to safe harbor as they were making their way across the country, because there were so many places. The majority of places were closed to people of African descent as they were making their way out. I want to say a little bit too about the stakes that were involved in this migration. We're a country of immigrants. We often think of ourselves as a country of immigrants. We also must remind ourselves, of course, that this is land that was taken from the indigenous people who were here before, and then becoming a country of immigrants. But the people who were part of the Great Migration were fleeing in some ways some of the same impulses, some of the same challenges and pestilence, you might say, man-made pestilence. They were escaping, essentially defecting from a caste system in the South, where it was actually against the law for a Black person and a white person to merely play checkers together. In Birmingham, you could go to jail if you were caught playing checkers with a person of a different race. They were fleeing a world in which the very word of God, the Bible itself, was segregated in courtrooms throughout the South. That meant that there was actually a Black Bible and altogether separate white Bible to swear to tell the truth on in court. That means that the same sacred object could not be touched by hands of different races, which was in many respects a hallmark of caste in the traditional sense of it. The idea of purity versus pollution is one of the pillars of caste. And so these are the stakes. Any breach of that caste system could literally mean a person's life. In the early decades of the 20th century, an African American was lynched every 3 or 4 days somewhere in the American South for some perceived breach of the caste system, the protocols that I'm describing here. So this was literally a matter of life and death. They were defecting this caste system. They were seeking political asylum within the borders of their own country. And it was the railroad system of this country and the interstates that they relied upon. Those were the escape routes that they relied upon. And so that's something that connects the department with this central history that reshaped the American cities.
So what do you think we can learn from that as a department that's today responsible for not just managing the safety of U.S. transportation, but really shaping the way our transportation system is going to develop as we think about the future of roads and highways, as we think about the future of railways and some of these more futuristic means of getting around that are in their absolute infancy. When you think about automated vehicles or some of the things going on with flight. What do you think would be important for us to bear in mind or to educate ourselves on as people who work on these issues every day, given the weight of that experience and the way that it of course, reverberates into our time?
Well, I would also like to say that in this week where we are recognizing what happened in Tulsa 100 years ago, the massacre, to recall how in some ways what happened there is reflective of what happened in so many Black communities, in which, first of all, of course, the massacre itself was singular and one of the worst civil disturbances in our country's history. But after they rebuilt, it then turned out that the interstates then destroyed additionally what remnants they had been able to rebuild afterward. And this is what happened in city after city, neighborhood after neighborhood, where African Americans became the ones who paid the greatest price for the interstates that we have. The interstates, as they were coming through the cities, then decimated these communities. I and my own family, both sides of my family, the places where my parents grew up, they're no longer there because they were destroyed they were raised, you might say, sacrificed to build the interstates. And this is a story that happened in many Black families. They can share experiences where their history was yet again sacrificed, lost for all time as a result of the perceived need for progress. And so I think that in approaching this, of course, I do not present myself as having all the answers, but I would say that in the way that I approach history, I approach it with a sense of humility, a sense of recognition of what has been lost as a result of the circumstances and inequities that have been embedded in our society. And so what I'm saying is I would believe that this would call for a humble recognition of what has gone before us and the recognition of the harm that has been done to these communities, and what can be done to make sure that in policies going forward, there is an awareness of the harm that has been done, so as to do everything that we can to make sure that there's no further harm being done and that access can be available for everyone. I would suggest that a recognition of what has gone before can help us have a better understanding of what we absolutely do not want to be doing going forward.
I agree that that's so important, partly in order to make sure that those harms aren't repeated, and partly because there may be a chance to do something to remedy them. And it's one of the reasons certainly in the president's vision and some work that I see emerging in the House of Representatives and other places, there's the idea of committing funds to reconnect places that were divided, often by pieces of transportation infrastructure that were funded with federal dollars. And so we're trying to do that work of the policy work, but also that work of recognition. I'll say that the humble recognition has proven to be more controversial than I might have expected. Just acknowledging the ways that racism got physically built into some of the highways in this country wound up arousing a much stronger public reaction than I might have guessed. Pointing to sometimes cases where there's documentary evidence, as in the case of, for example, highways built in the New York area, where it appears that it was intentionally set with lower clearances, so it'd be more difficult for buses that had primarily Black and Puerto Rican residents to be able to get to the beaches, which relates, I think, to maybe some of these ideas about access to water and purity that you've written about. But sometimes in ways that are never maybe documented or said out loud explicitly, but still encoded into our systems, like the idea that a highway might go through the area where there are the lowest land values because it's the cheapest to acquire. And if you investigate for a moment why those are the lowest land values, you'll often find that even like for like properties in a traditionally African-American neighborhood or a neighborhood where it's mostly property that belongs to another minoritized group, that they are less valuable for reasons that are inseparable from racism. And so I think just surfacing those facts has been an important part of how we account for the decisions we're going to make going into the future.
Might I ask? I'd like to say that how much I admire the willingness to address the history, and I would hope that one of the analogies in the book, one of the metaphors in the book, is that our country is like an old house, and those of us alive today are not the ones who built this old house. We have inherited this old house, and while we may not have been the ones who built the uneven pillars and joists and beams, we are the inheritors of whatever is right or wrong with it, and it is up to those of us alive today to do whatever it takes to make sure that this building is overhauled, rectified, repaired, and whatever is necessary to make it better for future succeeding generations. And one of the things that I'm excited to hear you speak about is that, interestingly enough, it turns out that you're in an amazing position to be able to shine a light on history that we have inherited. In other words, if the general public were aware of what had happened in previous generations that were in some ways embedding inequalities and into the very infrastructure of transportation, like the lower clearance, then that would be a way, that would be such an important way to serve the public and succeeding generations by recognizing and in some ways institutionalizing so that history is not lost. In other words, to convince people of the history that is right around us and that you have access to could serve such a tremendous role in helping Americans to see what we could not have otherwise known.
Well, I'm hopeful that we can do that also in a way that motivates action. It's not just about assigning blame or arousing a sense of guilt, but it's about setting ourselves that task, as you elegantly describe it, of revamping this house, this structure that has been there through centuries, but that we don't have to accept as given. And there is something poetic about the fact that we who work on physical infrastructure have a chance to do very literally, maybe think about where the posts and the beams are in this country and where they might be in a way that lifts everybody up. So this is something that has been on our minds, certainly from the perspective of physical infrastructure, but also in terms of how people work in fields related to transportation, whether we're thinking about the makeup of our own department, the industries that we touch from aviation to shipping, the corporate leadership and the labor unions that we work with, and generally people in leadership roles, and making sure that that reflects the country that we serve, that it reflects the taxpayers whose government this is. And I know that in many ways, historically, for many Black Americans, roles and jobs in transportation and or in government service have been pathways into the middle class. And yet we still see a big disparity in leadership roles. So I'm wondering, as we're thinking about, for example, inspiring a new generation of people who could be working in aviation and aerospace, but don't see a lot of people who look like them, to draw them into this work and empower them. It strikes me that you, I think when you won the Pulitzer Prize, you were the first African-American woman to do so in 1994. You too have worked in a field where you were not always surrounded by people who looked like you. What advice might you have for people who are considering their career choices, and or for an organization like ours that has a lot of eagerness to promote equity, but also, looking at our numbers, has a lot of work ahead of us?
Well, I think that it requires commitment from the top, which means that the department is obviously in great hands. Meaning, other words, by having the conversation, it makes it the priority, and it has to come from the top, so that everyone gets the message that this is a priority, that it is for the benefit of everyone. I think part of the challenge, one of the reasons that I have focused in on the work that I do, is that I have spent so much time looking at how we got to where we are, and I recognize the tragedy, you might say, of people who have had so much more in common than they've been led to believe, but because of the programming that occurs in our society, have not been able to necessarily see the benefits of opening up the world to everyone. And I think that that's one of the challenges, is to have all of us to see what is gained and what is the benefit to everyone, by having people of many, many different backgrounds in the room, in places of influence, to make better decisions. I mean, there have been many studies that have shown that when you have people from different perspectives, the problem solving actually expands the potential for solving the problem itself. And so I believe that there needs to be support at every rung of an institution for expanding. I mean, I think that to put people in positions where they may not feel that they actually have the support is one of the challenges that marginalized people have often faced. So encouragement and making this the priority, and sending the message that this is a priority, which is what you're doing by definition, by even holding conversations like this, I think sets the tone. And then recognizing that this is something that is for the betterment of everyone. I often describe, what is lost when you have hierarchy such as that which we've inherited in this country is that there's the very best people. Let me put it this way. When you think about the cotton fields, the rice plantations and the sugar plantations that were the main places where people who were African American have worked for the majority of the time that there's been a United States, the idea of being mainstreamed into the general society is a fairly new proposition for people who are African American in this country. And you think about those cotton fields and rice plantations and tobacco fields, and you realize that there were opera singers and jazz musicians and engineers and playwrights and surveyors and all kinds of people, pilots, on those sugar plantations and rice plantations and cotton plantations. And why do we know that? We know that because that is what they and their children and grandchildren and our great-grandchildren often chose to become once they had the chance to choose for themselves what they would do with their God-given talents. There's a picture behind me that is my father. He was a Tuskegee Airman. They experienced tremendous resistance, hostility, and in fact danger in trying to go about fulfill their dreams and their expertise as pilots. And they were not able to find work after the war. They were not able to find work as pilots, strictly segregated, caste oriented, because caste has restrictions on occupation. That was not an occupation that was seen as appropriate for people from that that rung of our hierarchy. And so they all had to remake themselves. And my father happened to have remade himself. He went back to school, got another degree, and became a civil engineer, speaking to transportation. And so what I would say is that to know the history, to know what others have had to do before us, and then recognizing the lost potential of the generations of we're speaking of African Americans. The vast majority of African Americans who ever lived in this country never had the chance to be who and what they actually truly could have become. And this is a chance to rectify that. Right now, going forward, this is a chance to rectify that.
It's a powerful image to think of the songs that were never composed or the books that were never written because talent was laid waste in this caste system. But as you say, a powerful motivator to make sure that we unlock what everyone is capable of. I want to dig in on one element of the caste system that is also, and I should probably explain for those who haven't looked at this research, part of the power in this analysis was looking at the kind of well-known and documented caste system that defines roles in traditional hierarchies and religious and social structures in India, and seeing just how similar that is to the systems that have defined racial hierarchies in the United States and in what became the United States really for the last 400 years. As you've explained in more detail and sophistication than we can go into here, caste is not quite the same thing as class, although we certainly have class systems too. But I think it's worth noting that certainly for Americans and for middle class Americans in particular, one of the most kind of naked expressions of social hierarchies happens on airplanes and trains where you literally have a first class. And something I think about a lot is belonging. And you've written about some of the experiences that you've had navigating the aviation systems as a passenger, including this question of having your belonging questioned as a first class passenger. I wonder what insights you think the particular rituals in transportation today might offer as we're thinking about how to unpack the interactions of class boundaries, caste boundaries, and other boundaries that kind of tell people where they're supposed to be, that might not match with, as you said, their God-given talents or where their achievements could have taken them.
Well, to your point, I mean, a society such as ours or any advanced society means that there are multiple hierarchies at work at any given time, and each of those hierarchies can restrict and thus deny all of us of the talents of all of our people. And that's one of the great tragedies that we are trying to work through right now, clearly. I want to make a distinction between caste, class, and race. I view caste is the infrastructure. It's not visible. It's the bones. In a building, it would be the joists and the studs that we cannot see, but we know that they're there because the building is standing and therefore they have to be there. And then race is the metric that happened to have been used as our country was being formed. Any number of metrics could be used in creating a caste system and creating a hierarchy, whether religion, ethnicity, language, place of origin, immigrant status, any number of things could be used to rank and to divide people. And as before there was the United States in the essentially early 17th century, the colonies of the Chesapeake began to divide people up on the basis of what we now call race, which is a social construct. It's a man-made creation, but that's the metric. So if caste is the bones, race is the skin. That's what we can see. It's what is the instantaneous cue as to where a person presumably, it tells the subconscious where this person is supposed to be located in a hierarchy, what their value should be, where we expect them to be working, what kinds of positions they are expected to be in. That is one of the metrics. Gender is also a metric as well. But race, what people look like is the signifier, the cue as to their place in the hierarchy. And then class is the one thing that presumably has more flexibility. It's the kind of thing that it suggests, education, clothing, accent, the ways that one presents oneself. And then so that means that if caste is the bones, race is the skin, then class is the things that we can change about ourselves, the clothing. And I would say that one of the ways I describe it is if you can act your way out of it, if you can find a way to act your way out of it, then that's class. You can yourself these certain measures, these certain indicators, physical indicators that you can change about yourself. But if you cannot act your way out of it, it's caste, meaning the presumably indelible markers that indicate who and where you belong in the hierarchy. And as we can see, there are only certain kinds of people that we will see in these videos face down in the pavement, killed before our very eyes, killed before our very eyes. And that's the enduring nature of caste, the ways that this physical signifier has been used to rank, value, and apportion whatever kinds of things that can be done to an entire group of people. And that's what we're facing in this current era still.
So thinking about how we navigate out of these harms, and I know we're drawing close to the end of our time, I wanted to finish by asking you about something you've discussed that rhymes a lot with a value that we're pursuing here at the department. So one of the values that we've laid out is very important to us in leadership and across the agency is that of empathy. That as we make decisions, it's very important to do it with empathy for everybody who'd be affected by the decisions we're making. And that's an internal value too, in terms of how we want to operate as coworkers. You've talked about radical empathy as part of a way forward. And I'm curious to learn what you mean by that. What's radical about it? Why is it important? And what does this idea or concept or value of empathy mean to you?
Well, I first would like to emphasize that is not the answer to, that's not the singular answer to overcoming the divisions that we face as a country. This requires a massive overhaul, a massive reinvestigation of where we happen to be as a society, at every sphere of our society: criminal justice system, mass incarceration, education, housing, everything. But in the meantime, there are things that each individual can do in the meantime. And I actually believe that radical empathy, had it been applied in so many of these cases that we are seeing, where literally a matter of life and death, we can see the complete total absence of any kind of empathy, much less radical empathy. When you think about these cases where we're seeing people killed before our very eyes, I'm thinking of the young girl in Columbus, Ohio, who was shot in the video surfaced while we were waiting for the decision in the case involving the killing of George Floyd. There was this video that surfaced, and it was a 16-year-old girl who was shot there on the video. That is something that has happened. As Americans, we need to interrogate and confront the fact that these things happen in our country at a higher rate than any of our peer nations. That's one thing. But after the people who are being killed have been shot down and they are now immobilized, one of the things that we never see in these videos is the basic human response of empathy toward another member of one's own species. In other words, the idea of some type of CPR, even just basic human comfort to someone who everyone on the scene knows is no longer a threat to anyone, and in fact, maybe in the final moments of their time on this planet. That is a severe breakdown in a society's sense of connection to one another in that society. It's a complete and total breakdown. And what I am suggesting is that radical empathy is beyond just the kind of empathy that we think of, well, we try to imagine what would we do if we were in a particular situation. Radical empathy requires that we're willing to do the work, self-inspection of our, what we bring to a moment, what our biases may be, and then to try to transcend those biases by saying, not just imagining what we might do in a certain situation that we might never be in, cannot truly understand from our own perspective, but to do the work of recognizing what has this individual that we're encountering, what has that person likely experienced, what is life like for them, what would someone in that situation do? Not me, because if you think about what you would do in a particular situation that you've never been in and never will be, that's essentially role playing. Deeper radical empathy requires doing the work of understanding another person's experience so that you can better understand why they're doing what they're doing, what their needs might be from their perspective. Again, getting back to our originating discussion about going from the ground up. What is it that the individuals that we are encountering actually experiencing from their perspective? That is what I consider to be radical empathy, and it requires work. It's not just coming in, allowing the subconscious to make its assumptions as it always does, but to be willing to do the work. And I often say that, one of the things that people will ask in any problem or challenge that they're facing involving another group is they'll say, why do those people do this or do that? You can think of whatever group, fill in the blank. Why do these people do what they're doing? And I would suggest, based on my work and my perspective that the work has led me to, is that there's only one answer to that question, only one. And the answer is, what do human beings do when they're in that situation? What do human beings do when they're in that situation? And then once you look at it from that perspective, it connects you as the questioner and the individual me as a questioner. It connects us to the experience of someone else. It takes us outside of ourselves, but also to recognize that this is an extension of us because this is another member of our own species. And that's what radical empathy forces us or encourages us or allows us to do.
Well, what a powerful idea, and also a challenge to approach empathy, not just as a thing we like to mention, but as a very challenging and expanding and important practice done in the way you described. I knew that this would be a really interesting and insightful conversation, and it absolutely has been. So again, let me thank you for taking this time to speak with me. I think that our team members at the department are going to find this a very interesting conversation, and look forward to continuing to follow your work.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I so admire what you're doing. I admire what you have done today. Admire all of you so much.
Thank you so much. Take care.